Hello, and welcome to the Fostering Lifelong Connections Collaborative Action Research on Family Time Practices presentation. This is a presentation by myself, Amy Conley Wright at the University of Sydney, and Billy Black, who's an expert by experience as part of the Fostering Lifelong Connections project. I'm also going to invite Billy to introduce her background. And our presentation is about less talk of contact, more talk of family time, how to build enduring connections for children in care. Billy, could you tell us about yourself?
My name is Billy Black. I am an ex-foster kid. I used to be in care myself. And ever since I was about 15, I've been working with systems advocacy for young people in care. I'm currently in training to be a researcher, and I've been involved in the project over this last year, looking at building resources for children in care and talking about trauma-informed responses before, after, and during contact.
Thank you, Billy. And before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, particularly the land on which the University of Sydney is built, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and to pay respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and any Aboriginal colleagues who may be viewing this training. We always like to take the opportunity to share the kinship module developed by our colleague, who's a chief investigator on this project, Dr. Lynette Riley, Associate Professor Lynette Riley. And she's also an artist with poker work on kangaroo skin. So I encourage you to check out her kinship module and to share that with carers. So the Fostering Lifelong Connections project is a collaboration among many people who have professional experience and focus on research in out-of-home care, as well as people who have lived experience. We're working with 8 partner organizations, and we have 4 sites across New South Wales. We're working in Dubbo, Maitland, Sydney, and Wollongong with our partners, the Department of Communities and Justice across all 4 sites. We're working with Bernardo's and Key Assets in Sydney. We're working with Care South and Catholic Care Wollongong and Wollongong, Catholic Care Hunter Manning and Wesley Delmar in Maitland, and with Uniting in Dubbo. We have a research team which includes myself, Professor Judy Cashmore, Dr. Lynette Riley, and Dr. Susan Collings, as well as our colleagues in the Research Center for Children and Families, Sarah Chifty, Dr. Betty Liu, Megan Mitchell, who's a PhD scholar on this project, and Suzanne Pope. And partner investigators, we're working with partners here in New South Wales, Matthew Jones from DCJ and Robert Urquhart from Bernardo's, as well as colleagues overseas, Professor Beth Neal and Professor Peter Bacora. And we have an amazing group of experts by experience and experts by profession who are the expert reference group for this project. We are working with 2 carers, 2 young people who've been in the care system, and 2 mothers who have had children in the care system, and experts by profession who include people in the court system, the legal profession, people who have experience in trauma, such as Professor Judy Atkinson and Sue Barati, and Loyal McLean. We are working with people, again, in the courts, like Marilena Albu and Roanna Medland and Ananda Hall, working with people who have practice expertise and work in DCJ, like Bernadette Wood, and people in the NGO sector, like Steve Kinmont. And we appreciate all of their times and contributions to this project. They're working with us to develop practices and resources that go along with these practices as we seek practice change around family time. So the kind of larger framing of this project is that it's about, that we are arguing at the Research Center for Children and Families that the model of permanency that's emerging in Australia is about permanency with lifelong connections. And this is really distinct from other countries such as the United States, where when there's a legal order or when children are permanently in care, they don't necessarily maintain connections and relationships with their family. Here in Australia, there's a huge emphasis on maintaining those relationships, just regardless of the type of legal order children are on, if they stay in permanent care. So we highlight in this figure that there's elements of relational permanency about keeping sort of secure relationships, legal permanency, the kind of legal order children end up on, and residential permanency in the home that they live in. And if we're going to really achieve this model of permanency with lifelong connections, we have to do different things, including listening to the views of young people, developing the workforce skills and processes to achieve this model, and the focus of this particular presentation, we need to develop relationship building practices, because these relationships between children's carers and families, they don't just happen. They need a lot of support, and they need skilled caseworkers to help put those relationships on the right track and to support them if they encounter bumps along the way. So for this project, the Fostering Lifelong Connections project, we're using an action research model called the Breakthrough Series Collaborative. This model was developed in the United States. It was came to us from the Casey family programs, and it's been used there in the child protection system where there's a clear issue that's been identified, and there's a set of evidence that can be drawn upon to try to make practice change. So the way the model works is we identify the area of focus, which in this case is the experience of family time. We look to the evidence to see what does evidence currently say around practices that caseworkers can put into place that may improve the experiences and outcomes of family time. And then we put that into action by planning out a practice test. And so we have a menu of practices, which I'll share for this project. And we also have a data collection plan so that caseworkers can select a practice, then they do it for a period of time. So they trial this practice with the families on their caseload for about a 6-month period in between learning sessions when we share as a group. On a monthly basis, they also meet together in reflective supervision kinds of groups and share about what the experience is like of putting that practice into place, what the impacts are on children and families, what they specifically did. And then we refine that practice. We ask the questions of what could be done better, what would support you to do this practice, and then we keep going through that cycle over and over. And we try to refine the practice and what we're learning from that practice. And I'll share some of our learnings today. So we have 3 of these action cycles in the project. This project kicked off in February of 2020 when we had a meeting in Maitland at the Morat Cultural Center, which is run by the Worimi Aboriginal Land Council. And we initiated this project. We talked about the principles of the project, which include cultural safety, trauma awareness, reflective practice, and selected the first practices and talked about how we would work together, the data collection. Then we had a period of action research, so about 6 months, where the caseworkers put this practice into effect and had these monthly meetings. We had our second learning session in October in Wollongong, where caseworkers presented case studies of how the practice worked when they developed this with their families on their caseload, and we reflected on our learning. We're now into our second action research cycle where caseworkers at the sites, each site selected their focal practice for the next period of time. And we will come together again in May of 2021 in Dubbo to learn about the outcomes of these practice trials. And then we'll have one more period of practice trials before we have our sort of final period where we have another learning session. We create more resources around practice, and we turn those resources into training that can be shared with all of our partner organizations and throughout the state about how to do relational family time. And we work with our partner organizations, as 8 partners I mentioned, to help to scale up the good practices that we've identified so that it becomes business as usual, not just a trial, but part of the regular day-to-day. And that will happen, so the project will finish by end of 2022. The menu of practices, we offer this menu of practices to our action researchers, who are the caseworkers and caseworker managers. And we work with 2 caseworkers and a caseworker manager from each of our organizations at the sites. And we invite them to select the practice that makes the most sense for them, that works in their local context, and then trial that for a period of time. So in our first action cycle, and I'll present about our learnings today, we had 2 sites that selected debriefing, which involved caseworkers meeting or talking to either the child, the parent, or the carer, or in one site, just the parent, before or after a visit to find out what worked well and what could be improved. And then sort of use that information to improve family time. And then we also had 2 teams who looked at facilitating family time at a distance. This was a practice that was selected before the COVID restrictions, but it worked really well, that we were able to learn in real time how caseworkers adjusted their preparations and how they adjusted family time so that families could maintain their connections either using technology, video chats, group chats, and also video games, playing them together, or no tech kind of options where they sent letters, artwork, photos to maintain those connections when they weren't seeing each other face to face. So I'll share some learnings about those two practices today. And in our current action research cycle, we have Dubbo focusing on cultural mentoring. And part of that for us is really documenting good practices that are already happening, but looking at how children's culture can be brought into family time and strengthened in that in terms of activities such as focusing on language during family time visits. Care coaching is the focus for the Wollongong team, and they're looking at sort of working with carers around an identified issue, a goal that they set together to improve that relationship with birth family. And then co-regulation is the focal point for Sydney and Maitland in the second action cycle, where we have some practice tools we're working with to work with birth relatives and carers to understand children's emotional responses to family time visits and put into place activities that can help them to manage the strong emotions and the trauma reactions that can come up before and after and during visits. So briefly, I'm going to share some of our reflections, our learnings from these practices that we've trialed. So the debriefing practice, again, where people sort of check in before or after a visit, we found that really provides a space for families, birth families and carers and children to express their views and feelings about family time, with that caseworker taking the role of actively listening and responding with tailored support to make changes that are guided by the family's views. And birth family in particular had mentioned to their caseworkers that no one had ever asked them before what they thought about the way family time was going. They didn't necessarily know that they had an option to suggest changes. And the kind of cases that came out of this were about people, kind of identifying ways that they could improve that experience and getting support to do that from the caseworkers. So that led to improved family time experiences. And sometimes those were easy fixes. So one example was a father who expressed, distress that he wasn't able to bring food to visits, and his caseworker gave him a gift card so he could bring food to the visit, and just really felt like that strengthened the relationship with the caseworker because that person was actively responding to the concerns of the father. We also heard about changing the locations of visits and varying them in various ways. Family time at a distance, again, this is where families either use technology or no tech solutions to kind of keep in touch when they weren't having face-to-face visits. We found that it was a really good way for people to reestablish connections that may have been dormant, where children didn't have those current relationships with family members. We heard stories about, there was a story about a father, for example, reestablishing a connection with his son who has autism. And it was a way of kind of easing back into that relationship without the overwhelming experience of being in a sort of longer face-to-face meeting. So just sort of slowly getting back into contact again, which allowed those interactions to be child-led and child-centered. So the child is able to really have some input into how long those interactions last, what they share. So they're able to share their room and their art. And it's not like a place where they're sort of necessarily stuck for a period of time that's pre-established by adults, but they can have some choice in that. And that created flexibility, and we heard about the benefits of that flexibility, causing less stress to people. Also flexibility, like things like being able to bring out the smartphone and let the parent see the child playing sport, which would be an experience they wouldn't have had otherwise. These kinds of interactions also manage to maintain connections between visits. So we don't see them as being replacing face-to-face visits. That's very important. But they maintain connections between visits so that it's, the parent can, or the other relative can know it's important to that child, what's happening in that child's life, which helps those connections maintain, sort of stay strong. And that can lead to more meaningful in-person visits because they know what's happening in the child's life and know about their friends and their interests, so they can have those meaningful conversations. So I want to pass over now to Billy, who's going to talk about key messages and the goal of family time.
Thanks, Amy. I know that as caseworkers and other professionals, I've worked myself as a youth worker with children in care, but also supervising contact or family time. And I understand that when we talk about contact and family time from the viewpoint of professionals, it's easy to forget what contact and family time means for the child. So my first question for you guys is, what is the goal of family time? I think it's often misunderstood to be sort of parental legal rights, children's rights to identity. That's the part of the case plan where you've kind of got the tick in identity and the tick in cultural connection. But removed children have unanimously experienced neglect, grief of loss. They're extremely vulnerable to attachment disorders and no stable anchors. I would say that the goal of family time is really to focus on children developing multiple long-term relationships that can provide a stable anchor point for their lives as they grow up and as other children who are not in care get to enjoy. This is how contact could be made a lot better at no cost to the system. It should emulate normal relationships as closely as possible. That is just what we hope for all children in care in all aspects of their life. And when you're thinking about how to improve the quality of care of children and quality of contact and family time, I think you have to think about your own long-term secure attachments. How do you connect with your family members, especially children in your family? When you get to catch up with your nieces or your own children, if you're away from them, are those visits mandated to occur 6 times a year in a specific setting? Are you able to call them and Skype them and text them and send them videos, play Minecraft online with them across the world whenever you feel like? I think that that's really important for children, because children need to have that continued infrequent contact. It needs to be highly accessible. It needs to be lower key. And it needs to be focused on developing those relationships to be those long-term relationships that will stick with them for life, because those attachment disorders are so prevalent in trauma-affected children. That this is basically the most important thing that we can do for them at very little cost or effort to ourselves. All of these types of contact, calling, videoing, gaming, they can all be supervised for children. They don't need to be a big hour-long commitment that happens on the second Sunday of every 3rd month. You know, we can educate carers to support and monitor 5-minute phone calls on a loudspeaker every few days, just to chat about Pokemon or the election or Baby Shark, NAIDOC week, whatever's happening in their life. A tiny amount of very frequent contact strengthens those developing relationships without all of the drawbacks and the trauma of organising face-to-face visits. Please remind your CSC manager that it costs nothing to encourage families to write an email to each other. Which brings us to emotionally low key. Because face-to-face visits can be extremely stressful for trauma-affected children, keeping it as casual and as emotionally calm a situation as possible will really help children feel secure enough to enjoy contact. You can't feel happiness unless you feel safe. Unless you feel safe enough to feel sadness and hurt. And there is a lot of sadness and hurt that comes with these relationships that have been somewhat damaged by the removal. There's a temptation, I think, to organise exciting fun events like theme parks and bowling and exciting water parks contact. And I understand that's to keep the associations of family with fun and exciting times. But those responses, those trauma-affected responses of fight, flight, freeze, and fawn crop up before, during, and after contact And even worse, that is sometimes misinterpreted as children not benefiting from contact. And sometimes carers say, he's so upset, we need to, pull back the number of contact visits we have per year. However, if we have frequent, emotionally low-key contact, a simple phone call, just card games, learning songs together, dream time stories, if that's appropriate, arts and crafts, just having a milkshake in the park, kids have that opportunity to chat and develop those relationships. With very heightened children, you might try video messages and letters. They're really good because the child can have that video message there and prepare for it for as long as they need to before they feel ready to see what mum has sent them. And you also have the benefit of not having any rejection against mum if it turns out that it wasn't as ready as he thought. But yeah, keeping that emotional low key will really help children keep their regulation. So please remind your CSE manager, it costs nothing to focus on calming, chatty, contact type activities. And then the third point is relationship development. The focus has to be on developing those relationships. Even when restoration is completely ruled out, contact is not some sort of consolation prize for birth families that, didn't manage to make the cut. It's an opportunity to manage secure attachments in your life long term. For some children, the realistic goal is not to aim to emulate a parent-child relationship going forward. For some children, it might be how to say no to their parents if they're inviting them to make poor choices. It might be how to require respect from long-term relationships. It won't necessarily be with birth family either. I know we're talking about family time instead of contact, but there are parts of your life and people in your life who aren't family and aren't identified as family that are really important, like music teachers or a soccer coach or whatever it is. As long as you've got this long-term ongoing relationship for the child, it is so much easier for them to experience that better regulation and those stable anchors in life that they can feel secure with. There's plenty of literature that shows that ongoing contact benefits children in care, even when it's hard, even if there are no plans for restoration. So please remind your CSC manager that it costs nothing to create frequent, accessible, safe, low-key contact that focuses on developing multiple long-term relationships with anyone who's important to the child. I've got here at the bottom, contact should emulate normal relationships as closely as possible. And this should be your rule of thumb whenever you make your contact plan or your family time plan. Think about how you stay in contact with your family, especially any children in your family, and challenge yourself to replicate that situation and that opportunity as closely as possible for these kids.
Thank you. Those are some really powerful takeaway messages. So in conclusion, I think we want to make a point, not to oversimplify things, but sometimes language is important in terms of shifting our way of thinking. Family time isn't only about family, as Billy pointed out, it's about important people in children's life. But if we use the term family time, it might remind us that family time is relational. It's about the quality of the interaction to build connection, and it involves communication in between those visits as well as visits themselves. I think the way we have been thinking about contact can be quite transactional. So it's about being in the same place at the same time, ticking off the court requirements, something vague about contact for identity, whatever that means, But really it's relationships that help people understand themselves and their place in the world. So we need to have the goal of making family time, to strengthen these relationships and to focus on the quality of the interactions. So that's all for our presentation. Thank you very much for listening to our presentation. If you have any questions, please do check out the Fostering Lifelong Connections project, which is available on the Research Center for Children and Families website. Thank you.